My name is Michael Rowan. I'm 39 years old, and I live in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of Chicago. I've spent the last 15 years working as a financial analyst, one of those jobs that sounds dull but pays just enough to keep you locked in. My life wasn't perfect, but it was stable, predictable. I used to think that was enough. Then I met Sophie. We met 3 years ago at a charity gala for a local hospital. She was there with her company, public relations for a pharmaceutical firm. I was there because my boss said I should network. I remember the first time I saw her. Red dress, a glass of wine, laughing with her colleagues like she owned the room. But it wasn't arrogance, it was something quieter, more magnetic. She had that kind of presence that makes everything else fade. She approached me first, asked if I was hiding from the crowd. I said yes, half joking, half serious. We talked for an hour that night about work, travel, the stupid small things that only matter when you're with someone who listens. When the gala ended, I walked her to her car. She gave me her number before I could even ask. 2 days later, we had dinner. 2 months later, she moved in. For a while, it felt like a story that had already been written, and I was just living inside it. Sundays cooking breakfast together. Weeknights curled up on the couch, watching reruns we'd both seen 100 times. She called me her anchor. I called her my reason. I thought I'd finally found peace after years of drifting through meaningless relationships. But peace, I've learned, can be a dangerous illusion. The first sign came subtle. A new perfume I hadn't bought her. The faint scent of cologne that wasn't mine on her scarf. Late night texts she said were just work. I told myself it was stress, deadlines, the usual noise of adulthood. You don't want to believe the person you love could lie that easily. You start making excuses for them, until your own reflection looks like a fool. But denial doesn't stop the truth, it just delays the explosion. It happened one Tuesday evening. I was working late from home, buried in spreadsheets, when her laptop pinged on the kitchen counter. A new email. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something about the preview caught my eye. Can't stop thinking about last night. Same time tomorrow. The sender, David L., her coworker from the PR department. My hands went cold. I opened the message before I could stop myself. And there it was, weeks of emails, casual at first, then intimate, hidden in work threads, buried in project updates. Can't wait to see you. I miss your snow. Let's not make this complicated. I read every line, every date, every word. And then I saw at the timeline. It had started 6 months ago. Half a year of lies. While she slept beside me, smiled at me, told me she loved me. 6 months of betrayal carved neatly into the inbox of a woman I thought I knew. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I printed everything. Every email, every message. I watched her through a different lens after that. Every word, every movement, every smile she gave me suddenly felt rehearsed. I saw the guilt in her eyes when I said, "I love you." She looked away, said it back too quickly. That's how I knew it was real, my discovery, not her feelings. For 3 weeks, I kept my silence. I followed patterns, watched her habits. She told me she had late meetings every Thursday. So, I followed her. It was raining that night. She left our apartment around 7 p.m., hair tied back, wearing the black coat I bought her last Christmas. I waited 5 minutes, then took my car. She drove downtown to a hotel near the river. I parked across the street and watched her walk inside. 15 minutes later, he arrived. The same man from her company LinkedIn page, David Langford, mid-40s, divorced. The kind of man who probably thought sleeping with a coworker was proof of his charm. They didn't come out for over an hour. When Sophie returned home around midnight, she smelled of rain and guilt. She smiled faintly when she saw me awake, pretending to work on my laptop. "Long meeting?" I asked. "Yeah. The client's a nightmare," she said. I nodded, smiled, and went back to my screen as if I believed her. But inside me, something quiet had shifted. Not rage, not heartbreak. Something colder. Calculation. People always imagine betrayal as an explosion, yelling, broken glass, tears. But real betrayal is silent. It seeps into you like smoke until everything tastes of bitterness. You start planning, not shouting. You start measuring your revenge in details. That night, I began taking notes. Every place she went, every message she sent, every lie she told. By the end of the week, I knew more about her than she probably knew about herself. I learned that David had recently been promoted thanks in part to a confidential campaign Sophie had helped him with. I also learned that she'd been transferring small amounts of company funds to a consultant account that didn't exist. That was when my grief became purpose. I wasn't just going to ruin their affair. I was going to ruin their lives. But real revenge is never rushed. It's built piece by piece, like architecture. You design it, calculate every risk, every crack in the foundation, until you can bring the whole structure down with one perfect blow. That night, I stared at her sleeping beside me, her face soft in the glow of the streetlight. I almost pitied her, almost, because when she woke up, she'd still believe everything was fine. She'd still smile, still kiss me, still call me her anchor. She didn't know that the storm had already started, and I was the one holding the thunder. There is a difference between anger and architecture. Anger is a flare, loud and immediate, and useless once it burns out. Architecture is patient. It waits. It considers load-bearing walls and weak joints. It thinks decades ahead. Revenge, if it is to be anything other than a messy confession, must be built the way a building is built, with plans, with proper permits, with an eye for what will collapse when you remove the cracked beam. So, I began to draw. I set up a routine that felt like normalcy to anyone watching. Mornings, I went to the office, real work, real clients, spreadsheets that demanded attention. Evenings, I cooked for Sophie, listened to her rehearse client phone calls, laughed at the places in her stories that were meant to seem amusing. In private, I mapped out. The first thing I did was inventory. What are the things people depend on? Reputation, money, relationships. If you remove two, the third becomes brittle. I decided to start with reputation because it's the most public, the most visible, and in our world it carries weight enough to topple careers with a single headline. Sophie's life, professionally, was a lattice. Her company, Bracken and Heath, was mid-sized, with one foot in PR and the other in lobbying. The client she'd been working on was a lucrative pharmaceutical launch. Her name was on the ownership of the campaign, publicly and in internal decks. That meant her professional face was exposed. One slip, and the industry would notice. David, by contrast, was insulated by years of being loud and likable. He had a buffer of charm. The trick would be to get behind that buffer and show the rot. I needed documentation, not just lusty messages or the footage of them leaving a hotel. Those things fuel gossip and hurt. But they don't topple the kind of towers built on contracts and quarterly numbers. I needed paper. Trails, budget lines, vendor names, anything that could be framed as negligence or malfeasance. Money leaves fingerprints, feelings do not. So I became a student of her world. I started with things that were, in retrospect, stupidly easy because we live inside self-documenting lives. The PR firm used cloud tools, shared drives, email chains. Sophie pinned documents to internal folders. She forwarded invoices to her personal email. Sometimes curiosity, laziness, a habit. I found one such forwarding by accident. A thread where she had sent a vendor's invoice to her Gmail with a note, "Hold until David signs." Off. The vendor's name was Grayson Media, a small contractor that, on paper, existed. The invoice numbers matched those I later found on the company portal, but the bank account listed on the invoice route D to a small LLC I'd never heard of. That's the boring stuff the press never loves. An LLC, a routing number, a naming pattern that is just shy of suspicious. But to auditors, it is lunch. To a firm's compliance team, it is oxygen. To a judge, it is a thread. I traced the LLC through public filings in a neighboring state. It was registered to a nominee I couldn't immediately identify. Nominees are how people hide. They are the paint over the rye. I placed a call to an old classmate who now worked in municipal records. He didn't ask why. He just said he owed me one and forwarded a scanned certification. The signature on the certificate matched a name I'd seen in a shareholder memo, a low-level consultant who had been quietly contracted by Bracken and Heath for focus groups. There it was, focus groups, invoices. Shell LLCs. I printed everything and put it in a folder I labeled Grayson Chain. The label was clinical, a small insurance against sentiment. I liked that about it. Sentiment gets messy. Filing does not. Next, I fed small, precise questions into the places that move faster than legal departments, other people's curiosity. I started with industry fora, the kind of private Slack channels where account execs gripe about clients late at night. I posted under a throwaway handle. Anyone seen odd invoice routing with Grayson Media? Heard whispers. The responses were slow, then quick. A junior producer from another firm replied that she'd been offered a consulting contract by Grayson last winter and had never received payment. A freelancer mentioned a bounced check. It wasn't proof. It was momentum. Momentum is a currency. People take action when they think everyone else is watching. I leveraged that. I sent an anonymous email to Bracken and Heath's finance inbox with a polite subject, request for clarification. Grayson and EDO account routing. The tone was neutrally inquisitive, like a client who wanted reassurance. No accusations, just a nudge that would make anyone with a guilty ledger uncomfortable. It worked. Within a week, an internal compliance flag was raised. An auditor requested backups. David's name appeared in the initial query because he had signed off as account lead. Sophie's name appeared because she had forwarded the invoice. I watched the way the firm's internal machinery moved, polite emails, calendar invites for a preliminary review. A message from HR to the marketing team reminding everyone about expense policies. There is something satisfying about seeing a human system react, like watching neurons fire in a living thing, but public exposure that required a different approach. I built relationships in small ways with a freelance journalist who wrote about corporate malfeasance, with a procurement officer at one of Bracken and Heath's clients who was surprisingly vocal on LinkedIn, with a former Greystone media contractor who, as it turned out, had been quietly collecting unpaid invoices. For months, I did not talk to them as a lover scorned. I spoke as an informed observer. People respond to facts more readily than to grief. Facts are a type of poker chip. I arranged a meeting with the freelance reporter, under neutral pretext industry chatter about vendor routing irregularities. I slid him copies of the invoices and the public filings. I didn't tell him about the emails. I didn't tell him about the kiss or the hotel. Journalists hate rumor. They live for a chain of custody. He liked a chain. He asked questions that sharpened the edges of the story. He asked to see bank transfers. I gave him what I had and kept back what might have felt like vendetta. There's a thin moral line between feeding a story and manufacturing it. I chose to stay on the feed side. The journalist, to his credit, did the rest. He smelled the potential for a larger systemic narrative. While the journalist worked, I focused on the psychological part. Paperwork provokes institutions, shame erodes individuals. I wanted both. I wanted Sophie to watch the scaffolding of her life wobble, but I did not want her to know I had built the scaffolding. So I adopted the oldest trick in the book for manipulating truth in small settings. Plausible slips. Small lies are surrendered by most people without thinking. A misplaced calendar invite, an accidentally CC'd message, a misdelivered draft. These are acts that feel like accidents, but can be engineered. I sent one to Sophie's inbox from a throwaway account meant to look like an external vendor asking for confirmation of bank details. Attached was a PDF that looked like an internal compliance memo. She forwarded it to David with a note, "Please confirm before I release payment." The forwarding created a timestamp trail that made it look as if she had corroborated a vendor account months earlier. It wasn't a fabrication. It was an engineering of her own likely behavior into evidence. When you play this game, you watch for patterns in human behavior and then nudge them so the patterns become more damning. Sophie liked to be helpful. She liked to resolve things. That became my ally. Then came the hard part. The legal access. Anonymous emails and freelance stories can embarrass. They rarely end things. To remove people from the map, you need more formal engines, audits, subpoenas, regulatory interest. I had to get the auditor's attention in a way that didn't look like a vindictive lover tipping his hand. So I wrote a letter. Not to a PR blog or a gossip column, but to a real division, the State Consumer Protection Bureau, that handles fraudulent consumer-facing marketing for pharma campaigns. My letter was neat, factual, and sterile. It pointed out anomalies in vendor routing, outlined a chain of small contractors who had not been paid, and attached copies of invoices and public filings. I signed it as a concerned industry observer. The letter landed in a mailbox that smelled of coffee and bureaucracy. It worked faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, a small team at the Bureau opened an inquiry. They requested initial documentation. Bracken and Heath's legal counsel responded defensively, then cautiously. They conducted their own internal review, always the sign that an external pressure has teeth. The world moved from rumor to process. All the while, I maintained the domestic performance. I made coffee in the mornings. I sat with Sophie on weekends, watched her fill out award nomination forms, and felt the taste of bitterness sharpen whenever she laughed naturally. It is a strange thing to sit beside the person who has caused you ruin and to practice normalcy like an actor practices lines. I learned to compartmentalize. I was at once husband and investigator, lover and architect. Compartmentalization is an efficient cruelty. It keeps things clean, but the mind grows restless with patience. There were nights when the sheets felt too big, and I would lie awake plotting the next move. There were mornings when I imagined telling her everything in a clean, violent confession, and then letting the universe judge. Those impulses were childish. I had learned that immediate confession gives people a chance to lie their way back into your bed. The better plan was the slow dismantling, the drip of consequences, until the person realizes there is no way to staunch the flood. One of my most effective moves was social rather than legal. I reached out to people in Sophie's professional sphere, old classmates, mutual acquaintances who owed favors, and fed them a timeline that emphasized negligence more than passion. I never lied. I simply framed the facts in a way that made people ask uncomfortable questions. Reputation is a social currency. Once people begin to whisper, the whispers gather. A junior account manager at Bracken and Heath, someone I'd once helped with a resume, reached out sheepishly. She said senior staff were nervy, that clients were asking questions, that the finance team was coming emails. She begged me not to do anything to blow up jobs. The plea was sincere. It landed in me like a small stone. I had to remember the point. This was about retribution tied to responsibility, not want cruelty. There is a difference, and part of my architecture was built around it. Then the journalist ran the first corroborated piece. It was careful, surgical, no mention of affair, no gossip. Instead, it focused on vendor routing irregularities, supplier complaints, and a picture of a company that had failed to reconcile internal controls. Sophie's name appeared in the margin as an account manager who had forwarded invoices. David's name was attached to approvals. The story didn't scream betrayal. It implied it, and that implication spread like an oil stain in a dry pan. The firm issued a statement promising cooperation. Each are circulated reminders about expense policies. The world watched. Sophie watched. I watched. The effect was immediate. Her lunches became guarded. She answered calls with a clipped professionalism. In private, she grew anxious in the kind of way people do when they know the scaffolding is failing but don't want to look at the hole. I watched her move through the house like a person in a glass museum, careful not to touch anything that might shatter. I could have stopped there. I could have let the press do the work, allowed the firm to self-correct, allowed David to be disciplined internally. But the discovery had become an axis for something more. The firm had layers, and above them were clients with power and board members with reputations more valuable than any one employee's career. If I exposed a higher node, the collapse would be broader and irreversible. I had to decide what kind of ruin I wanted, focused and personal, or public and cleansing. I chose a middle path. I wanted Sophie to fall hard enough to understand what she had done, but not so far that the ripples would drown the many innocents around her. Then again, this is what I told myself in quiet moments. Rationalization is the last room revenge builds when it intends to be moral. My next piece required a different tool. Betrayal as leverage. I started holding back certain documents from the journalist enough to keep him interested, not enough to be a smoking gun. I wanted the firm to feel pressure but to try and control the narrative themselves. People prefer to fix things quietly when they can. Some of them will rush to do that. Those are the ones who reveal more than they planned. I planted an anonymous tip at the firm's largest client, a hospital network that had been courted by Bracken and Heath. The tip was not about an affair or a kiss. It was insistently professional. Before you sign the final marketing contract, verify vendor routing and expense reconciliation for the campaign. There appear to be irregularities. The procurement team called their legal counsel. The delay was perfectly calibrated. It didn't accuse, it only injected doubt. Doubt is corrosive, and doubt is public. When a major client says hold, others notice. Investors notice. Boards panic. Pressure compresses. People make mistakes when compressed. They point fingers. They name names. Sophie started naming names in hushed tones. She began to explain away the forwarding of invoices as a clerical habit. She blamed David for pushing things through. She asked me once, in a voice that had the tremor of someone balancing on an edge, "Do you think they'll fire me?" She expected me to comfort her. Instead, I watched the tremor and catalogued it. It was a small, human moment of crackling vulnerability that felt deserved. There is a cruelty in being precise. You watch for the human cost, and you still proceed because your architecture insists upon completion. You tell yourself that there is value in consequence. Justice, you tell yourself with a tiredness that sounds like self-defense. The final element of the blueprint was timing. All the pieces I'd put in motion had to peak simultaneously. The journalist's corroborated narrative, the client's procurement hold, the internal audit, and an anonymous compliance report at the state level. When they converged, the firm wouldn't have the luxury of quiet fixes. They would be on offense, in public, with auditors and lawyers, and fewer options than they'd imagined. I timed a second anonymous tip to the State Bureau for the day of a major pitch when the firm would be most distracted and the client most vulnerable to doubt. I made sure the journalist was aware of the timing without revealing my hand. The day arrived. I walked into the office with a normal face, handed Sophie a cup of coffee as she rehearsed slides, and sat through the pitch with the same polite attention I had when we were still lovers and the world still made sense in a softer hue. They lost the account. Not in a dramatic, one-call way, nothing that cinematic, but in the slow, practical way of contracts evaporating under the humidity of doubt. The client rescinded their commitment pending an internal review. My phone buzzed with a text from the junior account manager. They're pissed. They asked Sophie to come in tomorrow with all her documentation. I smiled, a small, cold motion. That night she sobbed. She sobbed into the dark with a grief that was not contrite so much as frightened. She told me about the client call and how the procurement officer had asked questions about vendor routing. She said David was in tears. She said people were talking in the hallways. She asked me again in a voice that had returned to the place of small, uncertain supplication, "Why is this happening to me?" I made coffee and sat beside her. I put my hand over hers and felt the tremor. For a second, I almost said everything. I almost told her how long I'd been cataloging and who she'd kissed in a hotel parking lot. I almost let the confession be the final act. But I had learned, now, that the confession either saves or sinks. It gives the accused the chance to craft a narrative that might, with talent and tears, salvage what is left. So I stayed silent. I let her cry and listened to the way her breaths came in short, ragged waves. The plan was a slow machine, and I would be the man who turned the wheel until it completed its arc. At 2 a.m., she rolled over and slept, the tears dried, the sheets damp. I watched her and felt the strange satisfaction of seeing consequence arrive, but also an old, stubborn ache that did not soften. Revenge was working like architecture. The beams were moving, the walls groaning, but the building of me afterward felt unclear. What is the inhabitant of a house that you have built to ruin someone else's home? There are no easy answers to that question, only the next move. When that photograph hit the reporter's inbox, the tone of coverage shifted. No longer was this a story of fiscal mismanagement. Now it had the anatomical detail of human betrayal. The outlets began to mention names, internal romance, conflicts of interest. The firm's HR counsel released a statement about maintaining professional boundaries. Sophie's face appeared into different feeds with headlines designed to make strangers feel righteous. She called me that night as if someone had kicked over the last piece of scaffolding holding her leaf. Her voice was a raw, small thing. "They have that picture," she said. "They're running it." I did not tell her it was the same photograph I had taken months earlier and then left unshared like a fossil in a showbox. I had preserved that image because I thought I might need it, or because a part of me wanted to keep the memory of their indifference as my own private proof. I had not intended for it to be weaponized by a freelancer who didn't know me from a man in the street. But once an image leaves a private palm, it enters a market. She begged me to call the reporter, to tell him the picture was private footage, to plead for mercy. I could have. Many reporters appreciate the human angle. It might have softened things. But I had learned that pleas have a way of coming across as guilt. Instead, I gave her a list of lawyers' firm names that had good press and little patience for the press. I told her to pick one. She did, with trembling hands. She called them at dawn. Legal process has a speed of its own, faster in certain moments, glacial in others. Sophie's counsel threatened injunctions and threatened defamation suits. The media outlets blustered and then, cautiously, muttered about source protection. The photograph stayed in feeds long enough to make a stain. In the midst of the chaos, I received a message that snapped the night's fragile edge. "Meet me, tonight, the pier, 10 p.m. David's initial was a battery against my chest. He wanted to meet me. Maybe to plead. Maybe to threaten. Maybe to confess. Maybe to barter. I texted back, "Where?" He replied, "Pier 15, please. I need to talk." I sat in the dark and thought about what meeting him would mean. I thought about the other meetings I'd been to over the past months, the polite rooms with legal pads, the curt interviews with investigators. I thought about the man I'd watched in the parking lot, hand on her lower back, smiling like a man who thinks he has time. David had always been slippery. He was the kind of man who could charm his way out of many things. But when the drums of accountability beat, charm becomes a mute shirt. At 9:45 p.m., I drove to the pier. The city's skyline was a distant, indifferent glow. The river smelled of iron and cold. Pier 15 was a place of fishermen and late-night couples. a place that feels cinematic because it is a liminal space between water and land, lit and dark. David stood at the edge, jeans dark with the drizzle, back toward the river. He turned as I approached, visibly relieved and terrified at once. Up close, he looked smaller than the man in the office, a man whose jokes once filled rooms now cast shadows into a phone screen. "Rowan," he said. There was a rawness in his voice. He wiped his hands on his jeans, an awkward gesture of a man who used to have better manners. "I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go. You could have come to me months ago," I said. The sentence was factual, not rhetorical. He shook his head. "I know. I thought I could handle it. I told myself it was brief, that it meant nothing. It grew. It got complicated. I didn't mean to drag you into this. You dragged Sophie into it," I said. "You dragged your company into it. You made decisions. And you thought charm would cover them. You don't understand," he insisted. "The campaign, Harrison, if it fails, people lose jobs. I thought there were other ways. We were under pressure. Everyone was pushing numbers. You embezzled funds," I said. The word felt calibrated, not rhetorical. It was the legal term the Bureau would use, the phrase that might matter in a courtroom. "You created shell invoices. You routed money. You slept with the person who was on the account." David's face folded. "Yeah," he said, quietly. "Yeah, I did. I'm not proud. But I'm not the only one who benefits. You have to know there are people who profit from these tracks. They're not just me." "Who?" I asked. He swallowed. "There are investors. There are consultants. There are people who treat LLCs like pouches at a market stall and move money through them. It's systemic. It's ugly." He looked at me then and asked in his eyes, "Please, help me. If I cooperate, if I give names, documents, they might give me leniency. They might look at who else was benefiting. For you to give names, you'll need protection." I said. "The Bureau protects witnesses sometimes. But if you cooperate, you'll be testifying against people who have power." "I'll do it," he said, too quickly. "I'll do it if you make sure Sophie gets something. If you make sure her name doesn't get dragged through the mud on purpose." His plea had a horrible logic. He wanted me to be an arbiter of outcome, to leverage the knowledge I possessed not just about his malfeasance but about the larger net. He wanted me to pull levers I had already been pulling. And in that want, I saw my own reflection. How the machinery I'd activated now offered bargains to others. "You'll need counsel," I said. "You need to talk to Claire. You need to get this on the record." He nodded. "I can do that. I'll go in. I'll tell them everything. I'll hand over ledgers. I'll point to names." "Names like who?" I asked. He hesitated. "Reed. Mason Reed. He's the one who handled the consolidation. He set things up. He made sure payments disappeared into accounts nobody asked about. I didn't know he had deeper ties, board memberships, lobbying routes. I only knew he liked to move money." Mason's name felt like a boulder dropped in a calm pool. The ripples spread out, larger, dangerous. I'd suspected Reed, but hearing the name from David, a man cornered and desperate, made it feel immediate. It made the tentacles of the structure I'd poked at feel animate. If David was willing to flip, if he could provide documentation, the map of culpability widened. "Go to Claire," I said. "Don't talk to reporters. Don't do anything without counsel. If you hand over documents, make sure they're authentic and verifiable." And I hesitated. "Understand that cooperating doesn't guarantee mercy. It's negotiation." He nodded, tears forming at the corner of his eyes, less remorse than fear. "I'll go tomorrow," he whispered. "I'll go." We stood there, 2 men at the river, with the city behind us and the slippery face of consequence ahead. The night felt like a pause between heartbeats. I thought about what David could say, names, dates, bank transfers, and how it might expose a network that reached higher than Sophie's small betrayals. If he flipped, the case would mutate. It would stop being a story about an affair and become a story about systemic corruption. It would implicate the people who could pull strings and, potentially, the people who would not like being implicated. People with money have ways of making problems evaporate. They also have legions of people who do unpleasant things to keep things quiet. When David left the pier, walking quickly into the rain like a man trying to outrun his own shadow, I knew we had reached a new axis. The map had changed. The audit would either widen or close. The Bureau's investigators would either find a nest or a single bad apple, and somewhere in the city, I felt the sense of being watched not by the press but by other people who keep their own books in the shadows. I had started a thing that could grow arms. I hadn't anticipated. I had wanted revenge. I had not planned for the scale. That night I slept without dreams, which is its own kind of dreamlessness. I woke to Claire Jennings at my door, two uniformed agents behind her and a thin folder in her hand. "Mr. Rowan," she said, in the same calm voice she'd used before, "we need to talk." David came in this morning. The cold inside me had a geometry now. It was the shape of a man who had pulled a lever and watched the world shift. I opened the door wider for them, because whatever I did next would determine not just my future but the futures of people I had loved and destroyed. The only thing that felt certain was the knowledge that nothing about this game was ever clean. When Claire and the two agents stepped into my apartment, the room felt suddenly too small for the things it now contained: folders, printed emails, an old photograph on the mantel of Sophie and me on a summer weekend, a coffee mug I'd never throw away. Claire closed the door behind her and put a leather notebook on my kitchen table, the kind of notebook I recognized, one that would sit in a prosecutor's hands and become evidence. Her eyes were the same calm, tabulating look she had shown me before. She was not there to be moved. "Mr. Rowan," she said, folding her hands, "we appreciate your cooperation so far. David Langford came in this morning. He's provided documents that corroborate a pattern of payments and a link to Reed Ventures." She said the words like she'd rehearsed them in 1,000 quiet rooms. "We need to understand your involvement." My stomach tightened in that familiar way fear does when it wears a tailored suit. "I've been honest," I said. "I told you about the emails, the invoices. I didn't falsify anything." She nodded. "We know. But we also know someone was taking photos, selling them. We have a chain that leads outward." Her voice blurred the ends of sentences into the business of law. "We have to ask, did you ever provide photographs to anyone? Did you ever sell or distribute evidence?" The room contracted. For a moment, I considered telling the truth, the whole stupid, jag truth. I thought of the photograph I'd kept, the one I'd never used, the one that had nonetheless found a market. But there was a difference between confession and strategy. I had helped rip a wound open. I had not anticipated that others would pick at it for blood. I said carefully, "No, I didn't distribute anything. I never sold photos." She watched me with an expression that was meant to be dispassionate and felt like a verdict. "We'll need to verify that. For now, we need to know whether you have additional documentation you haven't shared. Anything that points to higher-ups, to Reed, to investors. If you have it, we need it now." I placed my hands on the table and felt the grain of the wood. The move was familiar. Lawyers love to see hands on wood. It made people feel accountable. I slid the folder labeled Grayson Chain toward her. "That's everything I have that's relevant," I said. "Bank filings, LLC registrations, invoices, everything I traced." She opened it, sifting with a speed that made me imagine an invisible scanner running through my life. "This will help," she said, "but we need a corroboration of flow, bank statements, transfer confirmations. We'll subpoena if necessary." Mr. Langford's cooperation speeds things up. He's given us names of the consolidation accounts, ledgers showing transfers to Reed. Hearing his name in her mouth felt like a footstep in a house I didn't know I'd entered. Reed. Mason. Reed. The man's name had been a rumor at first, a presence glimpsed in board meeting minutes and donation lists. Now it was a piece of prose in a government memo. "And what happens to Sophie?" I asked, before I could stop myself. The question came out more urgent than I felt. That urgency was not for her sake, really, but for the particular configuration of consequences I had imagined. I had wanted her to hurt. I had not wanted her to be erased entirely, in the way institutional devouring sometimes erases people. That's part of the calculus, Claire said. If she cooperates, if she provides documentation or testimony that clarifies her level of awareness or ignorance, it can be considered. But the Bureau treats evidence and intent separately. We don't negotiate feelings. Her voice was businesslike. It left no room for the human frailty I'd been clinging to as a kind of moral pillow. When they left, I felt the apartment slide back into a lesser light. The agents took copies. Claire left a card with a direct line, the kind you keep and never use until something terrible happens. I sat at the table and watched a gathering in my chest that felt like a storm. For the next few days, everything accelerated. David turned over spreadsheets with annotated transfers. Some of the numbers were small, a few $100s here and there. Others were larger, sums that, when aggregated, made run-on sentences of corruption. His lawyers negotiated immunity language in exchange for cooperation. He named show managers and a small phalanx of intermediaries. He fingered one particular pathway with a clarity that made your throat tighten. A series of micropayments into accounts in 3 states, then consolidated into a holding account under the umbrella of Reed Ventures. It was the kind of path that might have been invisible to many but was, to a trained eyebrow, a highway. The Bureau moved. Subpoenas went out. Mason Reed's name appeared in internal memos as a person of interest. The board of one client called for an emergency audit. The city's financial circles, those secretive salons where men and women exchanged favors like currency, began to whisper. At the center of all this, Sophie became smaller each day. She had the look of someone mapping out a life she'd no longer inhabit. The eviction of professional space had been one thing. The social erasure was another. Her friends called me with awkward silences. People who'd been casual on the periphery of our lives now treated me as someone who'd timed a weather event. At the grocery store, the cashier asked after how work was going in a way that suggested she already knew the answer. Small indignities accumulate into a social death, and yet there were moments when the old intimacy poked through. Once, in the supermarket parking lot, she reached for my hand as if to anchor herself to something real. And for a second I felt the texture of being tethered in a way that wasn't architectural but human. She leaned her head on my shoulder and asked, in a voice raw and small, "Why are you doing this to me?" The question was not an accusation so much as an attempt to find a reason that would make the world less hostile. I answered, "Because you chose secrecy over honesty." She sobbed then, the kind of sound that makes the world seem to tilt toward some tragic axis. She said, "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was scared. I thought I could fix it without anyone getting hurt." There was the old script: fear, rationalization, a plea for absolution, what people give when they want to be forgiven. I had been forgiven in other lives, given myself the benefit of the doubt. But this felt different. Her actions had consequences that radiated beyond our bed. Following that sob, she left the apartment to stay with a friend in a different neighborhood. We did not argue. There was nothing to say that suited the scale of what was happening. Silence, in the end, had become the most honest mutual language. With Sophie gone, the house felt both cleaner and lonelier. I kept the rituals: coffee at 7, a short walk before work, but they no longer had the soft punctuation of two people inhabiting the same senses. My days became an oscillation between meetings with Claire and small, precise acts of information gathering. I found myself late at night in the municipal records office, pulling public filings and bank registration notices the way a sculptor pulls wood shavings, removing what was extraneous to reveal structure. It was then that I saw it: a donation ledger to a small nonprofit that listed Mason Reed as an anonymous donor, funneled through a consulting payment to a company with the same routing number as Grayson's holding account. The ledger alone was not criminal. People donate money. People shield their names for tax reasons. But the same routing numbers, the same nominal companies, the rise of payments that could be traced to client campaign budgets, together they made a pattern that began to look like design rather than accident. I took the ledger to Claire. She read it in silence, then placed it under a reading lamp, hands folded. "This is the kind of linkage we need," she said. "It's not proof of crime on its own, but it's a roadmap. We can subpoena donor records. We can trace funds." I felt the thrill and the fear simultaneously, the old, precise satisfaction that comes from catching the right angle, and the chill that comes when you realize how big the thing is that you've just pointed to. If Reed's connections were as deep as the ledger suggested, we were no longer dealing with a couple of bad apples. We were dealing with a system of favors and consolidations, a discrete economy of influence. That's when the threats began. They were not threats made in bars or at the ends of anonymous text messages. They came as small, professional gestures designed to unsettle. My landlord received a polite but urgent subpoena for tenant records from a law firm representing a person of interest. The landlord called me to reassure, voice forced calm. My office received a subtle audit notice. Someone was questioning a contract I'd approved 6 months earlier. An unmarked envelope arrived at my condo with a single photograph inside. My car in the parking lot the night I had followed Sophie. No message, just the image. Someone was watching. I began to feel the presence of people whose motivations were not sentimental but strategic. They were the kind who moved in the margins: private investigators, corporate security consultants, men with expensive suits who made threats in genteel tones. It was as if the city had a second anatomy, and I had cut into a major artery. One evening, as I walked home from a meeting with Claire, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging. This will be over. M. Mason Marcus." The initial was enough to make the taste in my mouth metallic. The message had the flavor of both a threat and an offer. It assumed knowledge of my actions, of my access. It tried to compress my options into a simple contract. I did not reply. Instead, I texted Claire and told her about the message. She told me to forward it and to preserve the header information. She said what investigators say when a case turns personal: "We will protect you, but be careful." The phrase sounded like both promise and preface. That night I slept, if sleep it was, in short, watchful bursts. Dreams were sharp and fragmented corridors of marble, bank transfers skittering like insects, Sophie's hand pulling away. In the morning, Claire called. "David's deposition is scheduled for next week," she said. "We have motions to file and a list of witnesses. If Reed's name is involved, we'll need more corroboration." I set my jaw and kept moving. The city had shifted into a new posture. The posture of a market that smells opportunity and danger in equal measure. News vans began appearing occasionally outside Bracken and Heath. Reporters who had once filed tentative pieces were now doing background checks. The Bureau was not yet ready to go public. Lawyers were still parsing the edges. But the sense of an approaching verdict, legal, social, and moral, was palpable like a storm front. And then came the night of the deposition, which began as a sterile ritual and turned, in the span of a few hours, into something violent. David arrived trembling but resolute. His counsel had arranged for a secure room in a courthouse annex. Claire and 2 agents sat across from him as he began to read documents aloud. Dates, invoice numbers, emails that matched those in my folder. He spoke of meetings, of nights in hotel rooms, of payments made through nominals. He provided bank statements. His voice hardened as he recited the names of intermediaries. When he mentioned Reed, the room shifted. Papers were slid. A phone was thumbed. A lawyer's collar tightened. Then, on the second day, something happened that felt less legal than theatrical. A man arrived, thin, composed, wearing a suit that cost more than my first apartment, and asked to speak in camera with the Bureau's representative. He gave a name: Harold Finch, counsel for Reed Ventures. His presence had the air of someone who understood that power speaks in polite languages. Claire allowed a brief exchange and then returned with the news. Reed's lawyers wanted a protective order. They warned of reputational harm, of baseless accusations, of the damage of leaked documents. In other words, the classic procedural counterpunch. What followed was a flurry of legal maneuvers, motions, challenges, protective orders, and closed-door discussions. The court's day became a kind of chessboard where each side moved with predictable clinicality. It was intoxicating, and it was terrifying. The bigger the fish, the more ornate their defenses. The Bureau, patient but determined, pushed. Reed's legal team pushed harder. During a recess, one of Reed's junior counsels approached me under the guise of a civility the powerful often offer before they deliver blows. "Mr. Rowan," he said, with a practiced warmth, "we'd prefer you disengage. This isn't your fight. You have a life. We can make sure you aren't dragged into the weeds if you step back." His offer was both insult and enticement, a bribe wrapped in paternalism. "You want me to walk away," I said, "and forget the months of work I did because of a single betrayal?" He smiled thinly. "We offer to smooth things. It's in everyone's best interest." I left without taking his hand. The refusal felt both precarious and righteous. But walking away was not an option anymore. The things I had set in motion had acquired their own momentum. People had been hurt. Systems had been compromised. And I had become a node in a network that refused to be turned off. As the deposition proceedings continued, more names surfaced: donations, consultancy contracts, intermediary firms. The ledger linked to Reed seemed less like coincidence with each added page. The Bureau issued targeted subpoenas. The press, sensing that the story had teeth, began to whisper about systemic corruption. Social feeds filled with commentary that blurred the lines between empathy and schadenfreude. Through it all, a darker threat loomed. Someone punctured the anonymity that had kept me safe. An article in a smaller, less reputable outlet published a piece suggesting that the leak had come from an aggrieved partner who had been stalking Ms. Rowan. My name was suggested in the margins. The piece was coy, half-true, the kind of insinuation designed to stir public appetite. Sophie called me that night, voice low and sharp. "They're naming you," she said. "They're already naming you." I did not deny it, but neither did I accept the accusation as an endpoint. If I had become the public face of the vendetta, I could use that exposure like a shield. If people thought I was motive, the Bureau would have to prove otherwise. That was dangerous logic, dangerous, because it embraced the possibility that justice could be muddled by narratives. And then, the worst of all possible things happened: a late-night knock at my door. Not a polite legal visit, not Claire with an escort, but 3 men with faces I didn't know, 2 in plain clothes and one who carried himself like a man used to making problems evaporate. They stood under the glow of the hallway light as if they owned the building. "Mr. Rowan," the lead man said. "Yes, we need to speak," he said. His tone was businesslike, not a threat but a fact. "Outside." I wrapped a jacket around my shoulders and followed them down to the street. Rain had begun to fall. The city listened. The 3 men led me to an unmarked sedan idling a block away. They got in. The driver made a decision with a glance. The man in the back seat slid a paper across one of those glossy, official-looking envelopes with a legal seal. It contained a single typed sentence: "Cease all activity related to Bracken and Heath and its affiliates. Failure to comply will result in consequences beyond legal action." No signature. No identification of authority, just the kind of anonymous ultimatum that smells of power being delivered through private channels. When they let me go, the city felt colder. I walked home under a rain that felt like a judgment. The envelope burned a small hole in my pocket, emptiness and warning entangled. I lay awake that night thinking of the geometry of the thing I'd started. I had wanted retribution. I had wanted the people who had wronged me to feel the dislocation of consequence. But as I watched figures move in the margins, As messages arrived that were less legal than menacing, I realized that some systems do not tolerate being pricked. They respond. They retaliate. The line between justice and survival narrowed into a razor. If I pushed forward, Mason Reed and his circle could make life impossible for me. If I retreated, the Bureau's case might falter. If I compromised, I would become an instrument in someone else's moral ledger. I had to decide. And then, in the most unremarkable twist of fate, Sophie returned. She came back not with an apology but with a folder thick, heavy, the heft of someone who had been collecting as a defense. Her eyes were hollowed by nights she'd spent awake. She pushed the folder across my table without looking up. Everything, she said. I found emails I didn't send, invoices I didn't review but that were attached to my name. There are calls recorded in a vendor portal I've never used. I don't know how much I'm being used or how much I'm guilty, but I know enough to be scared. She looked at me then with the old desperation. We need to be smarter than them. For the first time since the parking lot, the instrument I had used for revenge felt like a partner, not in the sense of reconciliation, but in the sense of mutual survival. The enemy, whoever he was, Mason, Marcus, Reed, whoever had shown his hand. The stakes had escalated from careers to safety. I opened the folder and began to read. There were emails that contradicted what Sophie had told me. Invoices that bore my handwriting in forwarded headers. A strange pattern. Someone had been building a narrative that would insulate the upper echelons while letting others take the fall. The more we read, the clearer it became. This was not only about two people in a parking lot. It was about a system that used intimacy and corporate structure to obscure extraction. We sat in silence for a long time, the rain writing thin lines down the window. Outside, the city seemed to hold its breath. The danger was no longer only legal. It had the teeth of those who make threats in hallways and send glossy envelopes. We had reached the crossroads. One path led to retreat, handing everything we had to Claire, and letting the Bureau prosecute with whatever they could pull. It was morally tidy but practically risky. If the Bureau could not outmaneuver Reed's influence, the case would be strangled. Another path led to exposure. Go public with everything, with the photograph, with the ledger, with the narrative of corruption. That might force the system to react visibly. But it would also invite retaliation in the open. The third path, darker, more dangerous, was to meet force with force. To expose not just the paper trail but the people who had the power to intimidate. To cut them off at the knees by making their world public and vulnerable. Sophie looked at me, voice small. What do we do? I let the question hang. It was the kind of question that defines a life. The answer had to be precise, methodical, calibrated, and if necessary, ruthless. I had engineered collapse before. Now I had to engineer protection. Tomorrow, I said slowly, we give everything to Claire. We show her the ledger, the donations, Reed's links, and we ask for witness protection if necessary. But we also prepare a secondary line. We give everything to a journalist we can trust and arrange for simultaneous publication if anything happens to us. If they try to silence the Bureau, the story goes public. If they try to pressure us, the story goes public. Visibility is protection. Sophie's eyes widened. You mean, burn it all, not burn? I said, diffuse. Make it loud enough that quiet becomes impossible. Make it painful to cover up. She exhaled slowly. The plan was dangerous, but in its danger lay a brutal kind of fairness. If the powerful wanted to hide, the light would be trained on them. That night we packed copies of everything: the bank trails, the invoices, the emails, the photograph I'd preserved. We made duplicates, watermarked them, encrypted them, and distributed them across secure cloud accounts under false names. We rehearsed what we would say to Claire and what we would say to a journalist if the Bureau failed. We folded contingency into contingency. When the sun rose, it felt like the beginning of something irreversible. We walked into Claire's office together, two people who had once been lovers, and were now co-conspirators in a fragile, necessary fight. The city outside was indifferent, but the gears inside bureaucracies and newsrooms were beginning to turn. As Claire opened the file and scanned the first page, I felt the season of retribution shift into something far more complicated. The reckoning, and somewhere, miles away in a quiet office lined with books and glass, Mason Reed was probably sipping coffee and making a phone call to see how deep the water had gotten. It's been 6 months since the night everything ended. Chicago feels different now, colder, quieter, as if the whole city exhaled and forgot what it was holding in. I live in a smaller place near the lake, a one-bedroom apartment that smells like coffee and rain. No framed photos, no reminders, just space, silence. Some nights, I still wake up expecting to hear Sophie's voice. It's strange how your mind keeps playing old sounds long after the person is gone. Like a broken record that refuses to admit the song is over. I thought revenge would give me peace. I thought that once she and David fell, once their lives burned the way they set mine on fire, I'd feel something like relief. But peace isn't what comes after revenge. What comes is the echo. After the arrests, the city turned into a circus of headlines. Corporate fraud scandal at election, PR whistleblower uncovers financial crimes. The company's shares tanked, investigations opened. David Langford's name was everywhere, accused of embezzlement, breach of ethics, and misuse of confidential client data. Sophie's was right beside his, the accomplice, the enabler, the trusted partner. They called it the election collapse. It destroyed careers, reputations, and savings. When the dust settled, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by stacks of printed evidence, the same papers I'd once studied like blueprints. I realized how neatly everything had fallen into place, too neatly, like a perfect equation. But equations don't cry. People do. Sophie called me 2 weeks after it happened. I remembered that night in detail, the rain, the dim light from the window, the phone vibrating across the counter. I knew it was her before I looked. The name still burned into my memory. I hesitated for a moment, then answered, "Michael?" Her voice was hoarse, trembling. I could hear traffic. Maybe police sirens in the distance. "You did this, didn't you?" I didn't say anything. "Don't lie to me. Please, just tell me why." The question hung in the air like smoke. I could have told her the truth, that I wanted her to feel what I felt, that every lie she whispered into another man's ear carved a hole I couldn't fill, that destroying her wasn't about justice, it was about equilibrium. But I didn't. Instead, I said, "Because you broke something you couldn't fix." She sobbed. The kind of sound that doesn't ask for forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Then she whispered, "You were the best thing that ever happened to me," and for the first time in months, I almost believed her. Then the line went dead. I never heard her voice again. David didn't take prison well. He tried to fight the charges, blamed Sophie, the company, a rogue employee. But the documents spoke for themselves. Every falsified invoice, every hidden transaction. He got 3 years in federal custody. Sophie got probation and a suspended sentence. She lost everything else, her job, her home, her friends. Rachel, the investigator I'd quietly hired, told me Sophie left the city 2 months later. Some said she moved to Denver. Others said she checked into a clinic for a while. The truth is, I don't know. I stopped asking. I thought her absence would taste like victory. It didn't. It tasted like ash. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes after you burn your world down. You start noticing small things, the hum of the fridge, the weight of your own footsteps, the way the sky looks right before sunrise. It's as if your senses finally wake up once the noise of revenge is gone. One morning, I went for a walk by the lake. It was still early, the city half asleep, the air sharp with winter. I passed by a coffee shop where Sophie and I used to go on Sundays. The same table by the window was empty, waiting. I sat there for a while, watching strangers pass by. There was a young couple outside, laughing, sharing an umbrella. The kind of small tenderness you forget to appreciate until it's gone. And I realized something. Revenge doesn't erase betrayal. It doesn't rewrite the past. It just mirrors it, forces the other person to live your pain until it's all you both become. I had one, but the version of me who needed to win. He didn't survive it. That evening, I opened my laptop. There was one final email sitting in my drafts folder, the confession. Every document, every timeline, every manipulation spelled out in detail. I'd written it months ago, in case I ever decided to tell the world the truth. Instead, I deleted it, all of it. Then I printed one photo, Sophie and I at the gala where it began. I folded it twice and tucked it into a book I hadn't opened in years, not to remember her, but to remember the man I used to be before the lies started. Sometimes I wonder what she tells herself when she thinks of me. Does she paint me as the villain, the monster who ruined her life, or does she ever admit to herself that she created me? That every secret, every whispered half-truth built the man who finally stopped believing in forgiveness. Maybe she doesn't think of me at all. Maybe that's the real punishment, because for me, she'll always be there, in every silence, in every shadow that looks too familiar, in every reflection that stares back, asking if it was worth it. And maybe that's justice after all, not a verdict, not a sentence, but a haunting.